1991 Persian Gulf War, limiting where reporters could go and often restricting access to small groups of pool reporters. This time, the Pentagon is doing an about-face. After running more than 230 journalists through media boot camps, the Pentagon is inviting more than 500 media representatives to accompany U.S. combat units to war.
Despite being widely praised as a new form of realism in war coverage, the strategy of embedding reporters has raised new questions about the ability of war reporters to convey balanced information to the American people.
U.S. Army 7th Cavalry.
Rather than being kept far away, they were embraced and smothered and participated in the process of being smothered. They were brought along, hundreds and hundreds of them, with the Marines, with the Navy, with the Army. They became, in a sense, part of the invading apparatus. You didn't have embedded reporters with people who were being bombed. You only had embedded reporters with the bombers.
Last night, a tremendous light show here, just a tremendous light show as we were watching.
And it was through the eyes of the invaders that so much of the reporting was done.
It was a gradual process of getting to know and trust each other, and for them, trusting me was knowing I would not blow their objective and get us all shelled with artillery.
People who were correspondents for the major U.S. TV networks would express in no uncertain terms that they had been bonding very closely with the U.S. soldiers.
We have a number of correspondents in bed with our troops across the region. Some
very deeply embedded in a personal way with the Marine that he's traveling with, but he does remind.
And you had correspondents saying that, you know, I would do virtually anything for them, they would do anything for me. There's all this camaraderie.
We had guys around us with guns, and they were intent on keeping us alive because they said, you guys are making us stars back home, so we need to protect you. We need to, you know.
That's very nice, except it has nothing to do with independent journalism, which we never need more than in times of war. It was a very shrewd effort by the Pentagon to say, you want access? Here's plenty of access.
I doubt that in a conflict of this type there's ever been the degree of free press coverage as you are witnessing in this instance.
And the embedding process was actually a new wrinkle in an old game, which was and is propaganda for war.
Praise for the embedding process as a step forward in balanced war reporting has often invoked comparisons to media coverage of the Vietnam War.
A myth has kind of grown up after the Vietnam War that the reporting was very tough, that Americans saw on their television sets the brutality of the war as it unfolded. And people often hark back to that as a standard that should now be rediscovered or emulated.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about.
Yes, there was exceptional reporting, but it was the exception. And so you had the Zippo lighters being used by the GIs burning down the huts of a village that Morley Safer on CBS reported. Well, people mentioned that actually because it was unusual. And in point of fact, very little about the tremendous violence in that war was conveyed through the television set, especially when the U.S. government is responsible for the human suffering. That is, in a way, the most taboo, to show in detail, in graphic human detail, what's involved when bombs, missiles, mortars, paid for by U.S. taxpayers, do what they're designed to do, which is to kill and to maim.
I know that this is a great concern. I think it's part of the Vietnam syndrome.
The Vietnam syndrome that President Reagan mentioned was a reference to America's attempt to forget its most unpopular war.
This will not be another Vietnam. Our troops will have the best possible support in the entire world, and they will not be asked to fight with one hand tied behind their back.
Like President Reagan before him, President George H.W. Bush explicitly set out during the first Gulf War to rid the national psyche of the so-called Vietnam syndrome, the common belief after the bloody and protracted conflict in Vietnam that the American public no longer had the stomach for war unless guaranteed swift, easy, and decisive victory.
Precision weapons and the strategic use of air power helped make the Gulf War an enormous operational victory for the Pentagon, helping it move past the legacy of Vietnam.
Well, it's a proud day for America, and by God, we've kicked Vietnam syndrome once and for all. Thank you very, very much.
The idea is that supposedly the public is not willing to back strong military action because people have become too skittish about U.S. casualties. In fact, if you look at the actual course of public opinion, there's been a real willingness to support wars, without exception, at the beginning. Public support for the Second World War never fell below 77%, according to opinion polls. But during the Vietnam War, public support fell to about 30%, and within a couple of years of the U.S. occupation of Iraq, public support was down to almost 30% among the U.S. population. So what's the difference? In one case, World War II, the U.S. public never felt that the war was fundamentally based on deception. But if it emerges that the war can't be won quickly, and that the war was based on deceptions, then people have turned against the war. So first, the public has to be sold on the need to attack. Then, after the war is underway, withdrawal needs to be put forward as an unacceptable option.
Withdrawal of all American forces from Vietnam would be a disaster not...
Let no one think for a moment that retreat from Vietnam would bring an end to conflict.
If we're not leaving so long as I'm the president, that would be a huge mistake.
Our allies would lose confidence in America.
To yield to force in Vietnam would weaken that confidence.
Any sign that says we're going to leave before the job is done simply emboldens terrorists.
A retreat from the United States from Vietnam would be a communist victory, a victory of massive proportions, and would lead to World War III.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
It would not bring peace. It would bring more war.
And many propaganda lines become stock in trade of those who started the war in the first place.
The party of FDR and the party of Harry Truman has become the party of cut and run.
The American people will not stand for surrender.
Cowards cut and run.
They're advocating a policy called cut and run.
That party's old pattern of cutting and running.
If we hightailed it and cut and run,
we won't cut and run. Cut and run. Cut and run. We will not cut and run. Cut and run.
Cut and run. Cut and run. How do you respond?
We will stay the course. We must stay the course. We stay the course. We will stay the course. And we're not going to cut and run if I'm in the Oval Office.
All a president has to do is start a war, and these arguments kick in that you can't stop it. So it's a real incentive for a president to lie, to deceive, to manipulate sufficiently to get the war started. And then they've got a long way to go without any sort of substantive challenge that says, hey, this war has to end.
Then, appealing for public support for his peace policy, Mr. Nixon said the enemy cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans, he said, can do that.
The peacemakers are out there on the field. The soldier and the statesman need and welcome the sincere and the responsible assistance of concerned Americans. But they need reason much more than they need emotion. They must have a practical solution and not a concoction of wishful thinking and false hopes, however well-intentioned and well-meaning they may be. It must be a solution that does not call for surrender or for cutting and running now. Those fantasies hold the nightmare of World War III and a much larger war tomorrow.
During the Vietnam War, public opinion polls were showing, after a few years, into the early 1970s, that a majority of Americans felt the war was wrong, even immoral, and yet the war continued because the momentum was there.
Vice President Agnew's target for tonight, as he put it, was the professional pessimist. Most of those, the Vice President explained at a rally for California Republicans, are Democrats. And it was all the kind of rhetoric Republican crowds have been enjoying on this tour.
In the United States today, we have
more than our share of the nattering nabobs of negativism.
The same has been the case in terms of the occupation of Iraq.
The President and I cannot prevent certain politicians from losing their memory or their backbone, but we're not going to sit by and let them rewrite history.
And that's an insidious process because often those who oppose a war are simply discounted.
Congressman John Murtha, the first Vietnam vet to serve in Congress, a man awarded a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts, choking back tears as he talked about his change of heart.
It's time to bring them home. They've done everything they can do. The military's done everything it can do. This war has been so mishandled from the very start. Not only was the intelligence bad, the way they disbanded the troops, there's all kinds of mistakes have been made. They don't deserve to continue to suffer. They're the targets.
As an original supporter of the war and somebody known as a hawk, pro-military inside the Congress, John Murtha, despite his credentials, he was not taken terribly seriously.
This guy is long past the day when he had anything but the foggiest awareness of what the heck is going on in the world. And that soundbite is naivete writ large. And the man is an absolute fountain of such talk.
His recommendations to pull out U.S. troops discounted by pundits.
Pennsylvania Congressman John Murtha once again sounding like the Grim Reaper when it comes to the war on terror.
Murtha's running a psyop against his own people and against his own military. No, Alan, wait a minute.
As a veteran, I consider it my duty to defend those who defend America against repeated public attacks by a politician who cares nothing more than political and personal gain than the welfare of our fellow Americans on the battlefield.
And yet you looked at the polls and you found a large amount of Americans totally were in his corner on this.
I go by Arlington Cemetery every day. And the vice president, he criticizes Democrats. Let me tell you, those gravestones don't say Democrat or Republican, they say American.
And almost any analysis of public opinion data laid side by side with what news media are or are not advocating in terms of editorials will show that the media establishment is way behind the grassroots. In February of 1968, the Boston Globe did a survey of 39 different major U.S. daily newspapers. The Globe could not find a single paper that had editorialized for withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam.
And even when calls for withdrawal have eventually become too loud to ignore, officials have put forward strategies for ending war that have had the effect of prolonging it. In some cases, as with the Nixon administration's strategy of Vietnamization, actually escalating war in the name of ending it.
In the previous administration, we Americanized the war in Vietnam. In this administration, we are Vietnamizing the search for peace.
It's the idea that, okay, the war has become unpopular in the United States, so let's pull out some U.S. troops and have the military burden fall on the allies inside that country.
White House officials say it is obvious the South Vietnamese are going to have to hack it on their own.
The model is to use air power while pulling out U.S. troops and training Vietnamese to kill other Vietnamese people. And several decades later, in effect, that is a goal of George W. Bush's administration.
Our strategy can be summed up this way. As the Iraqis stand up, we will stand down.
The rhetoric about shifting the burden of fighting the insurgency onto the shoulders of Iraqi people themselves is very enticing for a president because it's a way of saying to people in the United States, hey, we're going to be out of there. It's just a matter of time.
There isn't a person at this table who agrees with you that we're in a quagmire and that there's no end in sight.
The media and political focus on the word quagmire is a good example of how an issue can be framed very narrowly.
The criticism would be that you're in a situation from which there's no good way to extricate yourself. And then
the word clearly would not be a good one.
Talking about a quagmire seems to be a positive way of fomenting debate because then we can argue about whether the war is actually working out well.
We are now
in a seemingly intractable quagmire.
That terrible word, quagmire.
This can be, or seems to be, a kind of quagmire.
Quagmire is really a false